Hey, it's Michael. If you've been on a Zoom with me lately, you'll notice that you have my full attention. It's because I'm not taking notes. Instead, I rely on Fellow, an AI meeting assistant, to take notes for me, along with tracking action items and decisions, handling recordings, transcripts, and summaries all in one secure platform. It's kind of like magic. Built with security and privacy at its core, Fellow is the only AI meeting assistant that thousands of leaders and organizations trust to capture meeting notes and recordings while keeping your data safe. They're so confident that you'll love it, they're offering an insane deal to you all, Between Two COOs listeners. 90 days of unlimited AI-powered note-taking and recording completely free. Visit fellow.app/COO to sign up today and experience the AI meeting assistant trusted by leaders everywhere. Hello and welcome to Between Two COOs. I'm your host, Michael Koenig, and today our guest is Jon Mark, the COO of Vestwell, the leading provider of digital platforms for workplace savings and investment programs, offering services like retirement plans, advisor-managed accounts, payroll integration, and state saving programs for employees and employers. They currently power nearly 25,000 small businesses with more than 1 million savers and $25 billion in assets under management in all 50 states. Vestwell has raised over $238 million in venture funding, with the most recent round of 125 coming from Lightspeed Partners at the end of 2023, which was and continues to be one of the most difficult fundraising environments in a decade. Why do I mention that? It's because Vestwell is for real and we need to pay attention to it. Jon, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Michael. Excited to be here.
So let's dive in. Tell us about Vestwell. You know, what is it exactly? Because there's a lot going on right now in the news about retirement, about savings, about preparation.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, all of these different savings products that you have at your disposal to help get a tax advantage, right? Each of them comes with its own sort of nuances of how to administer it. Each of them comes with education around how to best use it to set yourself up to get the maximum advantage out of it. And Vestwell is here to make that simple, right? At the end of the day, the more that we can distribute through people's workplaces, educate them, help them find that next best dollar for them to be able to put their money to use in a way that is most aligned to their goals. That's what Vestwell is all about. And with a particular focus in trying to do that in the smaller end of the market, making it so that every single American can have the retirement, the education, the healthcare that they need. We're here to help.
There are a couple of things that I love about Vestwell. We're very familiar with 401k programs that employers tend to offer, which are highly misunderstood. And employers tend to offer a match in good cases. Vestwell takes it a step further. We're talking about 529 savings programs for college. We're talking about much more diverse vehicles for savings that I really haven't seen other providers bring to the table. How do you all think about that? How has that sort of evolved over time? And where do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, I think like any burgeoning company that's trying to bring something new, differentiated to market, right? It had to start somewhere, and it started with the 401ks, the 403bs, something that people know pretty well. But it really started with, how do you take that experience and elevate it for a small business? How do you make the administration super easy with good payroll integrations? How do you make it so that for the end saver who is trying to put their money to work, you give them a really powerful user experience where they can actually take every action that they would need to possibly take for their retirement plan directly on a portal that's a piece of technology instead of printing out a form and faxing it,
Yes,
which
it is
still a very real thing in this industry today. And from there, I think the idea has always been the ambition that's just, finally starting to get realized, is the ability to take that one step further to say, hey, the 401k is great, but there's many other things you can save for. Like you just mentioned, the 529 education savings. But there's also other ways to put your money to work. And so, Vestwell, most recent acquisition was actually last fall and we ended up acquiring Gratifi from Morgan Stanley, and that's a student debt paydown product. So employers that want to offer the ability to help their employees pay down their student loan debt. And so, trying to incentivize, any type of good financial behavior that's going to ultimately help people put their money to work, incentivize the right things, and think of it in a very holistic way.
That's fantastic. And this couldn't be more timely, as I mentioned. Recently, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, which is a firm with over $10 trillion in assets under management, sent up a signal flare about the coming retirement flood and the lack of sufficient retirement savings in the US. Yahoo Finance also recently published a piece that people need to retire is around 1.5 million. I mean, can you comment on this and what you're seeing at Vestwell?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, what Larry's saying, what we're hearing in the news, it's all true, right? And, the call for action, I think while it's getting a lot of good publicity right now and it's super timely and super important, I think a lot of folks have seen this for quite some time, though. We're the largest provider of state-sponsored retirement programs. So these auto IRA programs where the state is basically saying, hey, if you're an employer of a certain size and you don't have a retirement plan, we're going to mandate that you offer a payroll-deducted IRA to start incentivizing your employees to have some mechanism to put money away without a lot of friction in the process. And so, I think that our government, our advocates, the private sector, everyone sees this problem that exists out there. The real issue has been and continues to be, how do you offer a product that actually has the ease of administration, the cost profile, the feature set that's going to actually be putting the right thing to solve the problem, right? And at the end of the day, if you're a, tow truck company in Nebraska and you're being told, hey, your options are, a very expensive, onerous product that's ultimately going to feel like, something that your employees may not necessarily want, that is going to be pretty unappealing. But if you can actually get something that's the right fit for the need, and it's going to, at the end of the day, no one's maybe excited to talk about retirement savings. But if you can provide something that for this thing that has to be done, that's going to be in your best interest, it can delight people along the way. I think that's a lot of what our product offers and why, we're doing what we're doing.
That's fabulous. And one of the reasons why I wanted you to come on is I've actually been sort of beating the drum and advocating at every single company I've been at since 2006 that, we really need to start thinking about retirement. Open up a Roth 401k. Let's talk about compounding interest. Let's talk about having the right credit card so you get the right rewards. So this is something that I'm passionate about, and my coworkers are probably sick of me even talking about it, but it's so vital that people start to understand this and take advantage of it when they're younger.
100%. And, my friends like to joke with me that they're like, oh man, John, I'm not sure if we should really invite you to this party. You might start talking to us about 401ks again. But at the end of the day, as much as I can nerd out about something like this, because it is an interesting puzzle to solve, like it's interesting in terms of how you bring a product like this to market. It's interesting how you actually can realize the innovative benefits on the back end, on the administration of it, to actually be doing something differentiated in the market, right? And yeah, I end up talking about it probably a lot. But I think there's also something to be said about the fact that if you aren't thinking about these things and you aren't actually taking the time to educate yourself on everything that needs to be done for you to set yourself up for a good financial future, you're probably not taking some necessary steps that you need to be taking, right? And one of the things that's actually kind of interesting that we've been seeing is sort of the prevalence now of how the conversation has shifted a bit from retirement savings to student debt. And one of the things that's interesting there is that Gen Z is acutely aware of how much debt they have. And they see, government promises not coming to fruition, a misunderstanding about what even is going to be the right thing to do. People are confused and they think that their debt has been canceled and they've stopped paying their the checks that come every month, the bills, and they're now finding themselves with credit score problems. And so in our minds, thinking about this holistically and bringing together all those different pieces has been sort of critical for us as a business, because ultimately that's what we're expecting is going to deliver to people the product as a tool to attract and retain talent that's going to be important and meaningful.
There are so many aspects to just personal finance, from retirement savings to active management, active budgeting. And there's really, one of the great platforms that was out there, Mint, was recently retired, and Intuit's moving everyone over to Credit Karma or whatever it may be. I think the only other one out there is You Need a Budget. But AI is bringing out some pretty cool budgeting tools, some pretty cool personal finance tools. How does AI fit into, let's first start with your product and how your product team is thinking about this in the future?
Yeah, we right now have about 30 different areas that we're looking at in terms of our AI strategy and how we think that AI is going to help really revolutionize this space. On a personal note, one of the things that I find to be so interesting is when I look at really complicated, nuanced questions within the retirement space, the education savings space. I keep finding that one of the best tools to explain these really complex topics ends up being AI, ends up being a chat GPT. The way that it can actually take very complicated things and boil it down, I think that's an incredibly powerful tool. So recently, we actually launched an AI chatbot into our platform. And one of the things that we're super excited about is, within the first 3 days, we saw 500 conversations had started. And what was really interesting to see is that not all of those questions were things like, how do I get my money, right? Like more procedural questions, but you started getting questions right off the bat that says, should I be saving now I'm 26 years old, right? And you have people that are really looking for some sort of intelligent agent to be able to understand your situation and start to give you advice, right? And one of the things that I think differentiates Vestwell in the sphere of folks who are offering sort of these new entrants into the different saving spaces is that we've always believed in the importance of the financial advisor, right? And I think one thing that's kind of interesting to think about is how the blend of AI and the blend of human intelligence becomes so critical in delivering people ultimately the right set of advice that's going to enable them to make the right decisions. Because while I think AI can do a great job of taking the esoteric and making it simple, at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to imagine a computer just being able to take everything in, understand the emotional aspects of what it means to be making financial decisions, and then ultimately deliver a piece of advice. And I think that's an area where we're going to see a financial advisor can spend less of their time educating people on the basic concepts, less of their time doing administrative work. And once this person comes in pretty well informed, can really take their time to use it in a more specific and focused manner to actually end up getting someone on the right path. And I think that's something that I'm particularly excited to see in this space come to life. There's all sorts of ways on the backside of how AI can be, used to make the business more efficient. But at the end of the day, my biggest focus right now is how do we make sure that for our end savers who are entrusting us with their retirement, education, health, whatever it is, right, that we can ultimately deliver them an experience that's going to help guide them on the right path, but also not necessarily find ourselves in a spot where we're trying to step on the toes of the people who could do something that I'm hard pressed to imagine AI replacing anytime soon.
Well, and wealth managers as well tend to be, they come into the fold once you hit that point of having wealth. And so one of the things I love about Vestwell is that you're really making that available at the earlier stage to help people develop that wealth. Now, you talked a lot about strategy so far. You're VP of strategy before you became COO at Vestwell, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about your career progression. But in the financial tool market, there's so many complementary things that go to this. There's a bigger holistic picture outside of just savings, right? There's estate planning, there's having your will, there's, budgeting, as I mentioned. You mentioned 30 different areas. From a strategic standpoint, how do you go about making sense of it all? How do you decide your strategic moves when there's so many ways you can take this product?
Yeah, I think that is so true. I mean, this is a space that has a lot of different products that are going to help with different pieces of the equation, right? I think what is our North Star, though, at the end of the day, is the savings piece, right? And so I think that there's plenty of consolidation opportunity within the space of savings or the space of being able to pay down debt, right? It's being able to utilize your money and put it against a savings or a financial wellness goal that's most important. You could go expand in all sorts of directions at the end of the day, but the chassis that we've built with our technology, right, is going to be able to most effectively be expanded and was built extensively to be able to power these types of products, right? And so when I look at that, I think strategically where my mind goes is there is so much opportunity to consolidate all those different savings vehicles that feels to me like the place to start. Still, early stage company at the end of the day, and the future, sometimes it's hard to fully predict. But I think that what we're going to find is with the sort of the different ways to innovate with the technology, that's emerging in the markets right now in the AI space, being able to just harness so much of what we've built to be able to apply it to these new other domains that I just spoke of. I think there's so much opportunity there that rather than trying to split our focus too many ways, that feels like a good way to make some real impact, in the near term.
Couple things here. First, I've had so many conversations with people about North Star, maintaining focus. I've never had a conversation with someone where they referenced it as a chassis, which I love. That's fantastic. But the next thing, I mean, come on, you're not early stage. You raised $238 million, multi-billion dollar valuation, $20 million assets under management, or was it billion?
It was billion, yeah.
Billion, yeah, forgive me. Tell me about the education component of it, right? That's something that you mentioned previously. We don't know a lot about savings for retirement. These aren't college courses necessarily that you get to take. And I remember my journey of financial literacy and understanding how I needed to do this. How do you all approach that? Because it is such a big component of this sort of planning and preparation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing to recognize is that everyone learns a little differently. And so our approach to date has been around figuring out the different methods that will be most effective to cover the most, have the most coverage over people, right? So some people want to have a library of resources, consume that information, be able to search for more, be able to continue to go down that rabbit hole. Some people want more of the it sounds so 90s, but like the wizard, right? Where they just are kind of guided down that tree. Some people want a consultation with a professional. They want to just explain their situation and sort of have the right information pushed to them. And I think our approach to the wellness and the literacy has really been focused around a lot of our clients come to us through a financial professional. And so part of it has been figuring out what is that individual's approach to how they've been selling their client on the wellness and the literacy. And then it's applying sort of a menu of offerings. And that kind of goes back to chassis, right? You want to have all of these building blocks, and then you enable a financial professional to build the experience for their client that they're looking for, but have enough options that that you're going to be able to assemble something very powerful.
And what's really interesting about this too is the business model and the target demographic and the go-to-market strategy, which we'll talk about in a bit, but it's a B2B2C sort of deal here where you're selling to either companies, you're selling to financial advisors, and then ultimately those customers, employees, whatever they may be, end up becoming your clients. Now, let me ask, employee turnover happens. Are you seeing employees who leave companies that got into Vestwell, are you seeing them continue on with your platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So, people at the end of the day, and we could spend some time again if you really want to get down the nerd path here. We could talk about the world of 401k rollovers, lost assets, and all sorts of things that are, in that space. And there's actually a lot of national attention being put over into the auto portability space to figure out how to make sure that people aren't losing track of their assets at the end of the day. But, for us at least, employees and end up building up a pretty decent nest egg in some cases on our platform. Some choose to roll it over to an IRA. Some choose to consolidate it into their next 401k plan, 403b. But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily, any one thing taking prevalence. It's more about what's right for that person at the end of the day.
Fantastic. And look, the reason why I'm going so deep into your product and so deep into the space is because as executives, we want what's best for our employees, whether it's total rewards, whether it's planning beyond just the job and planning for the future. And that's why I've really gone deep into this. But let's change focus here. This is about operations. You're in a heavily regulated industry, and I can always tell that by what's in the email signature, right? And you have the FINRA type of notification. How does that play into the operations of this business? It certainly has complicated it, I would imagine.
Yeah, what I would say that the regulations are interesting, but at the end of the day, all of these savings products that have a tax advantage, it's operationalizing the tax code and then doing it within the constraints of what the regulations will allow you to do, right? And from my perspective and how I've always approached my job is I am trying to figure out within a set of constraints, how do I create through people, process, technology, an experience that's ultimately going to be delightful for them and efficient for us. And that puzzle solving is sort of how, I try to describe it to anyone who's coming into like a leadership or a management role at Vestwell. It's that you are coming into a really complex space. You have to figure out how to abstract, how to generalize, how to basically build within these sets of very complex constraints, something that has not been easy to automate. And it's why there's been so few people who have attempted to kind of tackle this problem, and why it's been easier for most companies to throw, bodies at the problem as they've been able to find, labor in cheaper geographies, rather than actually solve the underlying technical problem or the underlying thinking problem of how do I properly conceptualize the right way to tackle this within this set of constraints.
So interesting. Yeah, you all couldn't have chosen a more difficult industry, maybe save, I don't know, nuclear technology, et cetera, et cetera.
I think about that every day, Michael.
Yeah, regulated industries are always a little bit tougher. I want to get back to your career progression. We mentioned BlackRock. You actually spent a lot of time at Bridgewater. And there were a couple of things that I was really impressed with, and I'm always impressed with, is people who progress within a company into not only more senior roles, but also areas of different expertise, which is something I actually find very necessary for COOs because we do have this generalist view across the board. Now, the reason I'm also bringing this up is because you started as the SVP of Strategy and Operations at Vestwell and then made the jump into the COO role within Vestwell. Can you tell me about that? Because it always takes that one person to give that opportunity to jump into the C-suite.
Yeah, I would say that, whenever someone asks, like, what is this path? And it's almost always for the purpose of saying, like, how do I try to replicate something like this, right? I always say that really it comes down to two things, and both are in your control. One is the desire to deeply understand the substance of the problems you're trying to solve, right? You can't just be able to approach it with a bunch of MBA jargon, right? You have to really get down and understand the cause-effect relationship between the different concepts, what the implications of those are, and really reason through it. And that reasoning is partly, I think some people are stronger at it than others, but it's not something you can't work to get better at. It's like training any muscle. You go to the gym, and if you lift enough times, you're probably going to get stronger at it. But it really starts with that desire to understand stuff. You have to think about how the pieces fit together. The second thing that I've always found is super important is finding people who will take an interest in your development. There's a big difference between a manager who is going to use you as a cog in the machine versus someone who wants to pour themselves into you in some way. And if you can find those people, and that's what I mean, like, obviously you are sometimes at the mercy of the person you work for, but you are also in charge of picking who you work for. And so to that extent, figuring out that person who's going to give you the mentorship that you need at that point in time in your career, I think that natural curiosity paired with good mentorship is sort of the best way to find yourself in an accelerated career path. So if I take that and I apply it to Vestwell now for a moment, right? How did I make that jump? I think it was applying those things, the years of mentorship, the mentorship that I get from our CEO Aaron, and being able to actually translate that into business impact. And if you can go solve a problem and you keep solving them and you keep putting results on the board, at a certain point, the results are going to speak for themselves, and it's going to become obvious to the people around you that it's a sensible decision.
Well, let's talk about that. Finding people who take an interest in your professional development. You mentioned, it's as a candidate backing up who's evaluating a business. It's the candidate is interviewing you and the business as much as you're interviewing them. How did you identify those mentors? How did you identify the opportunities that were going to give you that professional advancement and development?
I think it was two things, really. The first one was early in my career, the decision to go to Bridgewater was having a culture that prided itself into personal development, right? And so, finding a company that part of its ethos is developing talent, I think that is one piece, right? And that's what the easiest thing to look at from the outside. And it's also one of the things that I think is most important, especially in the very beginning of your career. Once inside a place like that, you have the opportunity to assess different managers. You can talk to your peers, figure out who does a particularly good job at that type of thing. And that's what I did. I moved managers a few times within Bridgewater, and it was constantly in the pursuit of finding people who I thought were going to offer me what I needed at that point in time in terms of development. And then when I made the decision to come to Vestwell, with a couple stops in between, the big thing that I looked at was I wanted to work for someone who I knew was strong at the things that I was not necessarily strong at yet, right? And I wanted to try to find a job that I thought, was roughly half of things that I felt like were in my wheelhouse to do and half things that were like out of my comfort zone, but were the things that I knew if I could get better at would just make me a stronger, professional to be able to have greater and greater impact.
There's imposter syndrome, right? I look for the same thing. Here's a role where I can do 50% of it, but this other 50%, I'm going to be, a fish out of water. And it's difficult to combat that sort of the imposter syndrome that you might get with that. How did you go about that? Well, was it even a thing for you?
No, it's a thing for everyone. And anyone who tells you differently is lying. Maybe that sounds a little arrogant to say, but I have pretty strong conviction in it. And I would say that the thing for me that helped me get past that was truly just wanting to figure out how things work, right? Because I figure the best way to get past the imposter syndrome is to really understand the situation. And if you can deeply understand the problem you're trying to solve, and you can come up with a solution and you can see a path from how to get to A to Z, then you may not feel like you necessarily are qualified. You may feel like you are an imposter. But if you can then show that, look, I have a practical and tangible path to, I think, resolving the things that ultimately I need to resolve to be successful in my role, I think that's how you can kind of offset it, right? I think it's when you find yourself in a position where you're so out of water, you can't even reason through the problem anymore. Everything just feels like there's no vector at which to start. That's when I find the imposter syndrome is, unsurmountable. But that's also where I reach on a different thing, which is I have mentors that can help me. And, you phone a friend, And often, believe it or not, like a little bit of clarity can go a long way to figuring out how to get from A to B. And once you get from B, it's actually more simple than you might think to get to Z.
It's so true. And one of the things that I always push on with anyone that I'm working with is don't assume that I know what I'm doing, right? I'm self-aware enough to be comfortable and confident in saying, hey, look, I don't understand this, but I want to learn. And you've mentioned several times about going deep, figuring out how things work. Here's the question. How do you do that without stepping on toes, without micromanaging? Because it's a real fine line and fine balance.
I think one of the ways you do it is by asking a lot of questions. Most of the time, I think people, whether they are in your part of an organization or another part of the organization, at the end of the day, if you are asking how things work, people are not necessarily going to be, they may get a little nervous if a COO is poking in to know how something works, right? But I think if you can do it with a disposition that disarms people because you truly are just trying to figure out how do we make this better, and everyone understands that we're all safe here, we're just trying to ultimately get ourselves to the finish line of winning, right? Then the questions don't feel so intimidating. They don't feel like the stakes are super high. And I think what's more important, though, is then, once you state, this is what I understand to be true, what you do about that may be in a different setting, right? So it may not be my place to say, hey, I think we need to change this, right? So I may end up in a situation where I'm talking, with someone 3 layers below me in a different part of the organization because I need to go figure out how something works over there to make other decisions. But I'm not going to tell that person what to go do. I'm going to go to the right place in the organization, navigate that, org chart to the proper place to then have the conversation about what do we do about it, right? Michael, there's something funny, though, that I thought it might be worth, mentioning. I think it was about 6 years into my relationship where my partner turns to me and says, I just don't understand how 2 people who could have such different risk tolerances can actually like each other. And I said, and I'll never forget this, I said, we have roughly the same risk tolerance. And I get this kind of like look at me like, what are you saying? Like, you're way more willing to take on risk than me. And I said, no, I get to the point where I dig so deep to understand the situation that I feel like I can understand the risk, that I'm more willing to take it on. But I'm not willing to just look at something and be like, this is really risky, I'm going to go do that, right? That's not like how I work. And I think that is one of, to kind of tie that back to the idea of, how do you go utilize this tool set of like building a deep understanding of like the substance of a situation. I think the place that it has so much applicability to is in that risk management space. And I think it's the difference between, leaders who look at risk as an impediment to getting impact on the board versus those who can actually navigate it effectively to make smart calls to ultimately get where you need to go, which is a hard thing to do when you're trying to grow a business as rapidly as the venture-backed space demands.
Absolutely. And here is I get asked quite frequently, what are the traits that COOs have? Because I myself am a multi-time COO, but also I get to talk with really talented COOs like yourself. And risk mitigation is such a big one, right? Part of our job is to guard the flank. You talked about going deep, right? And understanding. Do you have other ways and tactics to really start to manage that risk, whether it be capital markets risk, whether it be technology risk, whatever it is?
Yeah, I know this is going to maybe sound a bit pedestrian, but it really is just all about coming back to tying every risk back through a series of, cause effect relationships to money and time. Because at the end of the day, people talk about, oh, this is a risk of ruin event. And everyone goes, oh my gosh, we have to avoid this. And I go, why? Why is it a risk of ruin event? Like, what is it going to cost me? Right? What's it going to cost me? How much time is it going to delay? What will it delay? And if you constantly force all the people around you to avoid the buzzwords, to not just stop when they get told, well, we'll never pass our SOC 2, and you know how all of our big clients care about that. But you take it one step further to saying, okay, what will this cost me in money and time? I think that building that type of environment within the risk management sphere is what helps teach your organization to actually really know how to price risk properly. And then if you can give them good frameworks that are tried, tested, and true for how to go about doing that, and then it puts them in a position where they understand the right way to apply the industry best practices to the substance of your business. That's how you get to that place where people can actually explain, hey, this is, the risk of about $200,000 if it goes wrong. That's what we figured out as the maximum. And, can we, and the upside of doing this is for roughly, $100,000 of revenue. So does it really make sense? And you can be looking and say, do you think it makes sense? And you get a quick, probably not. All right, we're going to keep going. And that's just better when you can start to diffuse that responsibility out to more people. And they may not be the one who can ultimately cash the check or make the decision, right? But at the end of the day, if they can do as much of the thinking as possible, it just makes my job easier.
We've spoken a lot about strategy versus tactics. We hear these things all the time. I think they're very misunderstood. I think when we think we're forming a strategy, we're actually just forming a series of tactics by which we're going to achieve an outcome. Again, I get back to strategy because this is a big part of your career and expertise. How do you think about this? How should we think about this in terms of differentiating strategy and tactics and then also formulating our own?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, strategy and tactics are roughly the same thing on a different time horizon. At the end of the day, you're trying to pick what are the right things to bet on, right? And if I'm trying to figure out how am I going to have a sustainable, high margin business 3 years from now, I'm making a set of bets right now at this point in time that are going to deliver that outcome. And as I look, 3 months from now, and I'm thinking, how do I make sure this next board meeting goes well? I'm making a set of bets for what I'm going to do that's going to deliver that result, right? And so it's really just about the size of the bet, the time horizon that they have to play out on, and constantly adjusting, right? I don't think there's ever been a time at Vestwell that I can think of where I could lay out every little detail 9 months in advance and have it play out exactly as prescribed, right? It just never works out that way. And so I think that's, when I think about strategy, tactics, I think of it as a series of bets. They look a little different. They have different time horizons. They have different costs, different expected payoffs. But that's really what it comes down to. And a lot of that comes from the Bridgewater training. Make every decision as an expected value calculation. It was basically setting us all up to become poker players. So, here we are.
That's incredible. What an opportunity to spend such a big portion of your career early on, especially at Bridgewater. We're talking about one of the most successful companies in the world. I'm actually quite envious now. I think I made some career missteps.
We all have our own path, and it gets us to a great spot. And it's the nice thing is we don't know the other ways that the decisions could have played out, which is perhaps a curse, but I think of it more as a blessing.
Let's continue down the strategy road. I mentioned at the outset that you have 25,000 SMBs. You've spoken many times now about small, medium businesses, helping out those employees, helping out those customers. Usually the playbook for a SaaS company is get your foothold in SMB and then start building out your mid-market and your enterprise products. Is that something that factors into Vestwell, or are you truly, this is SMB, this is our ethos, this is our values and our mission?
So I think that mid-market space for us is totally within reach. And I think it's going to be a great place that as we've been able to sort of, build in additional bells and whistles to our product and to just our general operating model, that we become an increasingly great fit for. And I think it's areas where our emergency savings, the student debt pay down, retirement, that starts to become kind of an ecosystem of products that gets that mid-market excited. But our focus has been, continues to be, how do we bring all of that into the SMB space. Because I think for us, what we recognize is when you have 33 million businesses in the United States and only 3 million of them have a retirement plan, there's this incredibly huge market. And so if you can then bring them a retirement plan, bring them financial wellness, bring them the opportunity to attract Gen Z talent who's super focused on getting their debt paid down, right? You start to bring something really novel and interesting. And, part of why I chose Vestwell, I think, really came down to I wanted to work at a place where growth and mission, tied together in a way that like made it so that the work I do every day had a lot of value, to me personally, in terms of doing something that I think is like good for the world, just as much as it was, adding value to the shareholders, right? And so I think about, yes, you could go into a mid-sized business and, bring on, thousands of funded accounts, right? And yes, that's great for us as a business, but they were going to have a retirement plan, a workplace savings platform regardless, right? I get more excited when we get to go and really work with the SMBs and find ourselves in a spot where we are putting an employee benefit in the hands of people who probably wouldn't have otherwise had it because there wasn't accessibility to a product like that. So I think it's strategically good for our business to go tap a TAM as big as we are. I think it's from a mission perspective of trying to close the savings gap. I think it's also good on that front as well. So that's kind of how I see all those things coming together in a very like commercially and personally rewarding way.
Yeah. And just a quick asterisk there. TAM is total addressable market for those who are listening that might not be familiar with that acronym. Let's get back to acquisitions. You talked about acquiring Gratifi from Morgan Stanley. You were at Bridgewater. I'm very curious how, if one, Bridgewater had a tactic or a strategy for evaluating acquisitions. And if not, how do you view acquisitions?
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, if you can acquire whether it is revenue, you could acquire, a new product, talent that's going to be accretive to your business, to your strategy, right? There's all sorts of different sort of, headline drivers for why an acquisition would make sense, right? For the business. At the end of the day, the thing that I've always found to be super, super important is you have to form a very cogent deal thesis for how you think this acquisition will ultimately benefit the business. And you have to continuously measure against that. That's the biggest driver. All of our acquisitions that we've done have been because it's a product that gets us strategically closer to our mission of the savings gap. And when you actually look at the way that you price that acquisition in that deal, there was a clear path forward to seeing how it became a very positive growth for the business. And so that has been just the guiding light. And I know it sounds simple when it's just said like that, and maybe it feels a little obvious, but if you're just not comparing your expectations to your outcomes and constantly looking and comparing those things, you will often find yourself missing the mark. And that's just, no one wants that.
Throughout this conversation, as I've been listening to you, I am deeply impressed with Vestwell and your focus on the mission that you are doing and the focus that it brings to all of your business decisions, to your strategies, to your tactics, to your acquisitions, to your markets, whether or not you're going to move up to mid-market, whether or not you're going to stay with SMB. The clarity that you have expressed that is rooted in the mission is absolutely stunning, absolutely phenomenal. I'm so impressed because not all companies are like this. Hey, pat on the back for you all, really.
I appreciate it, Michael. I think it's a full team effort to get there, right? We brought together a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives, some folks who understand the industries that we're in super well, other folks like myself who are trying to come in with a fresh look and being able to, think more about like that generalist mindset of like, how do you scale something like this that was, can work at 20 new businesses a month to 500 new businesses a month, right? So it's interesting, and I think a lot of the time at Bridgewater also taught me how you have to think about assembling a great team, by thinking about the collective strengths that are needed and then assembling people together who in composite will bring those things to bear. And I think that's something we've done well at Vestwell.
That's fantastic. And so we're talking about mission oriented. How do you communicate that mission regularly? What are the levers that you pull, and how do you ensure that everyone is always reminded that this is how we make decisions?
I'd say a couple things. The first one is having a tangible North Star, right? Our mission is to close the savings gap, but that is an ethos, right? That is not something that you can tangibly attach a quantified, metric to, right? Funded accounts are, right? That is something and so we anchor our team, we anchor everyone in the company to the metric of saying we are trying to get more people to fund an account, or in the case of a debt pay down, to become, an active user of that product, right? And that's what we anchor our folks to. So that's one thing. It's like you have to have that anchor metric that matters more than all the others. The second thing is to, really embrace the clarity of objectives and have a forum of transparency for how you're doing against them, right? So for us, we invest a lot of time as an executive team building out an OKR framework for the year. Though the headlines don't change all that much, right? You're adding new distribution, you're connecting more businesses and individuals, you're getting more accounts funded, you're making sure that you do it as efficiently as you can, and that you're managing your risks along the way, right? That story doesn't change each year all that much, but what we're focused on under each of those buckets does. And then the second thing that we do is we make sure that, we use a KPI channel on Slack to be showing people every month, how are these things progressing? We have our all hands meetings where we're talking about the results that we're putting up on the board and what we're going to do differently based on what we're seeing. Hey, we're having a ton of success with this, so we're doubling down on this. We're seeing that this thing is stumbling out of the gate a little bit more than we wanted, but here's what we're going to do differently and what we've learned as a result of that, right? And so I think that having that communication is so critical for people, because at the end of the day, I find that most people want to do a really good job. And maybe that's a function of the world, or maybe that's a function of who we've hired at Vestwell. But most people want to do a really good job, but they can't do a good job if they're not armed with the broadest set of information of what is transpiring, because that's what's going to set them up to make the right micro decisions that we all make in every seat that we're in to be able to ultimately get the wins on the board that are needed, to keep growing a business like this.
Jon, it's time for my last and favorite question. We've all had those moments in the C-suite or in a leadership role where we've seen just something completely off the wall and thought, I just never thought I'd see that. Do you have one you can share with us?
Yeah, I do. I really wanted to tell you a story about the craziest HR situation I ever dealt with, and our general counsel told me I couldn't. But what I did think would be an interesting one to tell you is, everyone talks about the COO being the generalist. I want to talk to you about the night before we closed our acquisition of Someday from BNY Mellon. And I got 3 phone calls that night. The first one was how security wasn't going to approve how the CI/CD pipeline would work for the engineering team coming over. And I had to teach myself what that was and come up with an alternative. And that was like 5 p.m. 6 p.m., I got a phone call about how the health plans, the way that they worked was a little different than what we thought. And so there was going to be a lapse in healthcare for every employee for a month. And again, I had to go, I know ERISA pretty well at this point in the 401k world. I had to go learn a different part of ERISA that night. And by 6:30, we had figured out a solution to, make sure there'd be no lapse in healthcare. And again, you're thinking, okay, it's 6 p.m. This night can't, have another one of these, but it did. And I got a call around 7 that said, we actually just realized that we only built out this agreement to cover off mutual funds and not ETFs in this service agreement that's predicated as part of the close. And And we very quickly had to figure out like what would be an acceptable set of terms that would be different for mutual funds, different for ETFs that would be different from the mutual funds. And by about 8 o'clock, we had solved that problem. And, at that point, the next day, everything was able to get signed and delivered. But I just remember I look back on that night and think to myself, if you needed proof that a COO has to be able to handle a myriad of different domains, try solving healthcare, engineering, and, asset servicing in one evening. And but I look back on that and I just think like that's also one of those fun memories where you're just like, yeah, like this was a fun problem to solve.
Yeah. And underneath that, right, you're not just solving them, it's the team as well. So kudos to the team that's one, catching those, and then two, working with you to actually fix the problems, right? So that's,
yeah. And you couldn't be more right about that. I mean, like I look at that as like I'm making, judgment calls, but it's, all of the information and all of the ideas of what could solve the problem, comes from a great team.
That's fabulous. Jon, thanks so much for joining me. Where can people go to keep up with you and also Vestwell?
Yeah, I mean, Vestwell is on pretty much every platform that a business would put themselves on. So you can find us on LinkedIn, find us on Twitter. We have our blog on our website, always pumping out new and exciting financial literacy and retirement, healthcare, disability savings content. And every now and then I'll post something on my LinkedIn, like when I sit down with you, Michael, and record this podcast. So I'm pretty much just on LinkedIn, and would be excited to connect with anyone out there who wants to talk more.
Yeah, fantastic. And for those of you looking to connect with Jon on LinkedIn, it's actually Jonathan Mark. So there you go. Jon.
You're giving up my secret, Michael. I try to make it so that only the people who really know me would call me Jon.
Dang. Risk, right? Well, there you have it. Thanks to you all for listening to Between Two COOs. I'm your host, Michael Koenig, and a very special thank you to Jon Mark for joining us. Tune in next time for our next COO chat on Between Two COOs, and be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Just visit Between Two COOs for more information. And if you have a minute, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and tell others about it so they can get great advice from phenomenal COOs. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Tune in next time, and until then, so long. Hey, it's Michael. If you've been on a Zoom with me lately, you'll notice that you have my full attention. It's because I'm not taking notes. Instead, I rely on Fellow, an AI meeting assistant, to take notes for me, along with tracking action items and decisions, handling recordings, transcripts, and summaries all in one secure platform. It's kind of like magic. Built with security and privacy at its core, Fellow is the only AI meeting assistant that thousands of leaders and organizations trust to capture meeting notes and recordings while keeping your data safe. They're so confident that you'll love it, they're offering an insane deal to you all, Between Two COOs listeners. 90 days of unlimited AI-powered note-taking and recording completely free. Visit fellow.app/COO to sign up today and experience the AI meeting assistant trusted by leaders everywhere.